Alright, this is your creation. My name is Starseed Bey. Today we're going to be talking about some interesting stuff. I was really debating how I wanted to talk about this, and it was kind of interesting on how this all kind of turned out. But the incident with 1952. So in Washington D.C. there was a huge phenomenon. UFOs started popping up quite frequently in 1952, and it ended up having a where these UFOs ended up showing up in Washington, just right above Washington D.C. Um, and it was quite interesting. So we're going to be talking about that and kind of a history lesson too. And we're going to start with World War II. So we'll see how this turns out. It should be interesting. A lot of information too, so yeah, it should be fun. But let me go ahead and plug myself here real quick, and then we'll get going. So if you guys are interested in learning more about me, I do have a couple Facebook pages. I got a private Facebook page and a public Facebook page. So if you're interested, just type in Starseed Bey, and you'll find me there. And then of course you got me on YouTube as well. So if this is your first time watching me, definitely check me out on YouTube. I've been doing videos for quite a while, so definitely like, subscribe, share, and all that good stuff. So yeah, I did start a Patreon page as well, but I'm still working on it, so I'll start showing you guys that here later. So yeah, so anyway, so this is huge stuff. You really kind of see a pattern unfold as we talk about this stuff. I've always been fascinated with UFOs. There's just something about UFOs, ETs, Star Trek. Big fan of Star Trek. Love Star Trek. There's just something about it that I just always fascinated me about it. You know, and the original Star Trek itself, oh man, I love the original Star Trek. It involves so much, so much. I mean, from the standpoints of like even races, right? Races, you know, like, you know, we still struggle with people, you know, white people and black people and natives and all that stuff. You know, we still struggle with that concept. So with Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry really kind of made it different and unique. So, you know, he brought in all of these ET beings, right? Because of Star Trek, right? So they brought in all these ET beings. So it's basically was, you know, learning on how to communicate with different beings around the universe, but still maintaining, you know, that Earth itself had already became a one unit. You know, it wasn't about race or the dividing of countries or nothing like that, right? The Earth was one unit, you know, the United Federation of Planets. So all the United Nations all became one, and we all started to work together and created this big space force, right? The space force that was generated from Earth to go out into space and then go and discover undiscovered planets and civilizations and different kind of beings and so on and so forth. So Star Trek is beautiful, man. I love Star Trek. It's just it's awesome, man. So that's always been my fascination with ETs. I've always just wondered what has been out there, as well as encounters I've had personally with shadow beings and so on and so forth. You know, so it's quite interesting. Hey, how's it going, Rain? So yeah, it's fascinating. So we'll go ahead. This is where it really all really kind of begins here is World War II. And every time someone, I even talked about this. I was talking with Michael Basham on his podcast a little bit, and you know, they always, you know, people in the churches and stuff always view Revelations as it has not happened yet. It has not happened yet. Well, if you do some more research on the book of Revelations and during that time period, it tells you exactly what kind of war that was, what it represented, who they were fighting against. so on and so forth. So you really have to do a history lesson. You have to do your research. You have to do a history lesson. No what ifs, no assuming. You know, people focus on beliefs and faith without doing the research. You know, without doing the research. Research is key. I mean, are you going to find the total truth? No, you're not. You're never going to find the total truth. I don't really think anything is designed to be a total truth. But it's part of the research. It's part of the discovery or the excitement of discovering new things, discovering new things. So yeah, that's how this whole video got made, was just from research, just kept on going. So yeah, so World War II, man, if I lived through World War II, I would have thought the world was ending. I would have thought that destruction, I mean, we'll read here in a second how many people died. It said between 50 to 85 million people died in World War II. 50 to 85 million people. That's insane. That is crazy. And, you know, you would think that the world was ending there, and then that Christ would come back, you know, and then heaven would be on earth and so on and so forth. Well, that didn't happen. And we survived World War II, right? It was rough. It was rough. I mean, you read through after World War II, it was rough for everybody. But it was a key point that we need to think in our heads, you know, that destructions of this nature has already happened before. Destructions of this nature has already happened before. Can it happen again? It probably can. Can we rebuild from it? Yeah. Based on where we're at now, yeah, we survived World War II. So, I mean, if there's another one, I'm sure we'd survive that too. Hopefully not. Hopefully not. You know, I feel that if we ever had a World War III, it would be from a spiritual standpoint. It wouldn't be physical like a World War II. It would be a spiritual, like an energy war, like an X-Men, you know, like the mutants. You never know, man. You never know. But yeah, we'll go ahead and read up on World War II. Like I said, I got a lot of stuff we got to cover, so I want to try and keep this under an hour, hopefully. So World War II, also known as the Second World War, was a global war that lasted from 1939 to 1945. Although conflicts reflecting the ideological clash between what would become the Allied and Axis blocs began earlier, the vast majority of the world's countries, including all the great powers, eventually formed two opposing military alliances, the Allies and the Axis. And I'm really interested about this Allies and Axis, so I had to do some research on that because that's kind of interesting in how they named it that. It was the most global war in history. It directly involved more than 100 million people from over 30 countries in a state of total war. The major participants threw their entire economic, industrial, and scientific capabilities behind the war effort, blurring the distinction between civilian and military resources. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history, marked by 50 to 85 million fatalities, most of whom were civilians in the Soviet Union and China. It included massacres, the genocide of the Holocaust, strategic bombings, oh man, I hate saying that word, premeditated death from starvation and disease, and the only use of nuclear weapon in war. The Empire of Japan aimed to dominate Asia and the Pacific and was already at war with the Republic of China in 1937. But the World War is generally said to have begun on September 1st, 1939, which is interesting because a lot of stuff happens in September. Always. There's always something that is starting or ending in September, so I find that fascinating. The day of the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany and the subsequent declaration of war on Germany by France and the United Kingdom. From late 1939 to early 1941, in a series of campaigns and treaties, Germany conquered or controlled much of continental Europe and formed the Axis alliance. Oh, I guess we're going to start learning about this. So the German, or the Nazis, created and formed the Axis alliance with Italy and Japan under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939. Germany and the Soviet Union partitioned and annexed territories of the European neighbors, Poland, Finland, Romania, and the Baltic states. The war continued primarily between the European Axis powers and the coalition of the United Kingdom and the British Commonwealth, with campaigns including the North Africa and East Africa campaigns. Which is interesting because, it's the United States isn't even involved yet in this, so that's kind of interesting. Let's kind of fast forward here because this is long. Let's see, what's this one here? Including the North Africa, as well as the long-running Battle of the Atlantic. On June 22nd, 1941, the European Axis power launched an invasion of the Soviet Union, opening the largest land theater of war in history, which trapped the Axis, most crucially the German, whatever that word is, into a war of attrition. In December 1941, Japan attacked so this is where it starts. So in December 1941, Japan attacked the United States and European colonies. Once you do research, you'll know exactly why the United States and Europeans are working together, because it's the Romans. It's the Romans. So that totally makes sense. And you'll learn more too about why Nazi attacked the United States as well. So United States and the European colonies in the Pacific Ocean, and quickly conquered much of the Western Pacific. The Japanese conquest were perceived by many in Asia as a liberation from Western dominance, which is very true. You look into, well, losing my phone here, which if you look into like the Freemasons, the Skull and Bones, thing of that nature, you know why this war was happening, because they were creating the United States and the Europeans, or the Romans, the Vatican, so on and so forth. They were creating their world war dominance, which is what I was talking about with the archons. You got, if you run the banks, you have a huge military function, right? Huge military function. And you run the churches, you have the building blocks to run an empire, which is exactly what the United States and Europeans were doing. So quite interesting. And this throws a twist too, in realizing, that World War II could have been a war that was trying to stop the domination of the United States. So something to think about. Let's see. Quickly conquered. The Japanese conquest was perceived by many in Asia as liberation from Western dominance. As such, several armies from the conquering territories aided the Japanese. So see, a lot of people were behind the Japanese to go against the United States. The Axis advance halted in 1942 when Japan lost the critical Battle of Midway, and Germany and Italy were defeated in North Africa, and then decisively at Stalingrad in the Soviet Union. In 1943, with a series of German defeats on the Eastern Front, the Allied invasion of Sicily and Italy, which brought out Italian surrender and Allied victories in the Pacific. The Axis lost the initiative and was forced into strategic retreat on all fronts. In 1944, the Western Allies invaded German-occupied France, while the Soviet Union regained all of its territorial losses and invaded Germany and its allies. During 1944 and 1945, the Japanese suffered major reverses in the mainland Asia, in south-central China and Burma, while the Allies crippled the Japanese Navy and captured key Western Pacific islands. The war in Europe concluded with the invasion of Germany by the Western Allies. So the war in Europe concluded with invasion of Germany by the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, culminating to the capture of Berlin by Soviet troops, the suicide of Adolf Hitler, supposedly, and the subsequent German unconditional surrender on May 8th, 1945. And it just kind of goes on through there. Let's see, in July 1945, in the refusal of Japan to surrender under its terms, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities. So, since Japan refused, the United States began to retaliate against the Japanese. Interesting. That looks like that lasted till about August, with the invasion of the Japanese, whatever that word is, imminent. The possibility of additional atomic bombing and Soviet invasion of whatever that is, somewhere in Japan, formally surrounded on September 2nd, 1945. See, again, September. This stuff ended in September 2nd. So September 1st, let me make sure I read that right. September 1st was the beginning of the war. Yes, September 1st, 1939. And then the end of World War II was September 2nd, 1945. Always in September. You have stuff that begins and stuff that ends. Always. It's bizarre. It is bizarre. And there's a reason behind that. Actually, someone told me some interesting things, so I'll discuss that in another video. But yeah, so it ended in 1945. A long war, a lot of fatalities. And it said on here too, World War II changed the political alignment and social structure of the world. The United Nations was established to foster international cooperation and prevent future conflicts. The victorious great powers, China, France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States became the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. The Soviet Union and the United States emerged as rival superpowers. And while the decolonization of Africa and Asia began, most countries whose industries had been damaged moved towards economic recovery. Political integration, especially in Europe, emerged as an effort to end pre-war enmities and to create a common identity. So fascinating stuff. Fascinating. And quite interesting. So we're going to continue on that. So this ended in 1945. I am going to read this here real quick again. What national security is, because this ties into a lot of reasons why things are the way they are, why things are covered up. They say it's to protect us, but it's so much more to it, because I mean there's so much more to this world we don't know. So hence why they created the national security thing. So I'll read this again real quick and then we'll go from there. So national security refers to a security of a nation state, including its citizens, economy, and institutions, and is regarded as a duty of government. Originally conceived as a protection against military attacks, national security is now widely understood to include non-military dimensions, including economic security, energy security, environmental security, food security, cybersecurity, and so on and so forth. Similarly, national security risks include, in addition to the actions of other nation states, actions by violent non-state actors, narcotic cartels, and multinational corporations, and also the effects of natural disasters. Governments rely on a range of measures, including political, economical, and military power, as well as diplomacy to enforce national security, that may also act to build the conditions of security regionally and internationally by reducing transitional causes of insecurity, such as climate change, economic inequality, political exclusion, and nuclear proliferation. Big words, man. Big words. Let me see when this started. I don't know when it started. It doesn't really give me a date, but I'd say it probably started roughly after World War II. So that's national security. All right, so let's see. Make sure I don't get lost here. So that was 1945. World War II ended. Then we go into... Oh, what was it? Was it this one? Yes. All right. So now we're going to get into Operation Paperclip. And this happened after World War II. So World War II ended in 1945 of September. And then we got Operation Paperclip. Was a secret program of the Joint Intelligence Objective Agency, largely carried out by the special agents of Army CIC, in which more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, such as, I don't like to say names, but it's just 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, and his VTech rocket team were recruited in post-Nazi Germany. So after they won the war, they took this 1,600 scientists, and the U.S. government employed them primarily between 1945 and 1959. Many were former members and some were former leaders of the Nazi Party. The primary purpose for Operation Paperclip was U.S. military advantage in the Russo-American Cold War and the space race, and we'll talk about that too. The Soviet Union were more aggressive in forcible recruiting at gunpoint. I mean, they were ruthless, man. More than 2,200 German specialists, a total of more than 6,000 people, including family members, with operational, whatever that word is, during one night on October 22nd, 1946. The Joint Chiefs of Staff established the first secret recruitment program called Operation Overcast on July 20th, 1945, initially to assist in shortening the Japanese War and to aid our post-war military research. The term overcast was the name first given by the German scientists' family members for the housing camp where they were held in Bavaria. In late summer 1945, the GSC established the JIOA, a subcommittee of the Joint Intelligence Community, to directly oversee Operation Overcast and later Operation Paperclip. The JIOA representatives included the Army's Director of Intelligence, the Chief of the Chief of Naval Intelligence, the Assistant Chief of Air Staff 2, Air Force Intelligence, and a represent from the State Department in November 1945. Operation Overcast was renamed Operation Paperclip by the Ordnance Corps, United States Army officers, who would attach a paperclip to the folders of those rocket experts whom they wished to employ in America. In secret directive circulated on September 3rd, 1946, and this was during the presidency of Truman, officially approved Operation Paperclip and expanded it to include 1,000 German scientists under the temporary limited military custody. Again, September. So yeah, so quite fascinating stuff. So, you know, after World War II, then we got a whole bunch of German scientists. Now here's where things get real interesting, because, you know, if you do research on the brilliance of Germany was really high tech in a lot of technology. I mean, you even look at Adolf Hitler, what he was interested, he was interested into ET race, the Pleiadians, he was interested in that. He was interested about these other ET beings that were on the planet as well. So there was a lot of interesting things that was going on. So Germany had a lot of amazing scientists back then. So of course, I mean, if the war ended and you had all these brilliant scientists, why wouldn't you bring them over? And of course, they brought them over by force too. So yeah, so quite interesting stuff. So yeah, and that went all the way through to 1959. So we're going to go ahead and read between that, which would be the Roswell incident. All right, so I always like Roswell because that was always one of the starting points. I think that when we look into research for UFOs or ETs, we always end up coming across the Roswell incident. So Roswell. In May of 1947, a United States Army Air Force balloon crash, of course that's what they concluded at the end of the day, at a ranch near Roswell, New Mexico, following wide initial interest in the crashed flying disc. The U.S. military stated that it was merely a conventional weather balloon, which is why I was reading about national security. It's all about national security. Interest subsequently waned into the late 1970s when UFOologists began promoting a variety of increasingly elaborate conspiracy theories, because they always like to label things that they don't want to be as truth as a conspiracy theory, so they can just kind of brush it to the side. claiming that one or more alien spacecraft had crash landed and that the extraterrestrial occupants had been recovered by the military, which then engaged in a cover-up. In the 1990s, the U.S. military published 2 reports disclosing the true nature of the crashed object: a nuclear test surveillance balloon from Project Mughal. Nevertheless, the Roswell incident continues to be of interest in popular media, and conspiracy theories surrounding the event persist. Roswell has been described as the world's most famous, most investigated, and most thoroughly debunked UFO claim. But again, fascinating because it's from 1947. And again, the war ended in 1945. Then the German scientists were taken, and then we got this 1947 ordeal. And it kind of reminds me too with there's a documentary I watched a long time ago with Adolf Hitler, and that's where I kind of learned on his fascination with these Palladian beings and I want to say witchcraft and so on and so forth, blonde-haired and blue-eyed people. I'm very fascinated with that stuff. But one thing I learned is supposedly they had already created a spacecraft of sort, a spacecraft-looking military craft that could fly at the speed of light. I mean, basically, the Nazis got a hold of this ET technology. And supposedly, according to the documentary, I had to do research on it. According to the documentary, they were able to go to Mars and so on and so forth. So, they already kind of had that technology. So it's interesting with this UFO thing, or this Roswell thing, was in 1947, a little bit after World War II. So, you could put into that concept with that awareness of what happened with the Nazis and stuff, is that maybe this was the Secret Service or the military exploring more into the spacecraft that the Germans were building. I mean, they brought over 1,600 scientists. I mean, they had advanced technology beyond means, and it could be from ET origin too. Hard to say, but they definitely had advanced stuff. And the funny thing is because they brought all these scientists over, and if you do research, and we'll talk more about it, if you do research on these German scientists, they revolutionized scientific research in the United States. And that's why I always tell people that the Nazis actually won, because they dominated the scientific research facility. It's bizarre. Just do research on it. So I think that's pretty much it for Roswell. I mean, there isn't really much else that we don't already know. So that was 1947. Then we go into, and make sure I'm not missing any gaps here. I'm trying to read this in order. So let me kind of close off the ones we've read already. Let's see. Not yet. So yeah, so we'll go ahead and read the Washington thing. What's his mainly what I titled this. So in 1952, Washington D.C., there was UFO incidents. Like there's a lot of unidentified objects that were flying through, also known as the Washington Flop. The Washington National Airport sightings, or the invasion of Washington, was a series of unidentified flying objects reported from July 12th to July 29th. And speaking of which, let me get my pictures going here. Hold on here. Here we go. There we go. So the most publicized sightings took place on the consecutive weekends of July 19th through the 20th and July 26th through the 27th. UFO Hysterian called the incident the climax of the 1952 UFO flap. Never before or after did Project Blue Book and the Air Force undergo such a tidal wave of UFO reports. At 11:40 p.m. on Saturday, July 19th, 1952, an air traffic controller at Washington National Airport, which is today known as the Ronald Reagan National Airport, spotted 7 objects on his radar, which is interesting again, and you're going to see a pattern here. But this reminds me of what they just showed, I think it was last year, the same thing. They showed this on the news of these objects flying back and forth, right? Flying back and forth, and they didn't know what they were seeing. And they put it on Fox News, whatever. Well, I have a theory that that footage they showed us is from 1952. And I'll get to my theories here later, but I have a theory that it's the same thing. We're in a repeated cycle. So, let's see, what do we got here? Spotted 7 objects on his radar. The objects were located 15 miles south-southwest of the city. No known aircraft were in the area, and the objects were not following any established flight paths. A senior air traffic controller at the airport watched objects on radar scope. He later wrote, "We knew immediately that a very strange situation existed. Their movements were completely radical compared to those of ordinary aircraft." Two controllers checked the radar. They found that it was working normally. Then called National Airport's radar-equipped controller tower. The controllers there said that they also had unidentified bleeps on their radar screen and that they had seen a bright light hovering in the sky. It took off, zooming away at incredible speed. Did you see that? What the heck was that? At this point, other objects appeared in all sectors of the radar scope. When they moved over the White House, the key thing, 1952, these objects moved over to the White House and the United States Capitol. Astonishing. And why this stuff is never talked about before, I don't know. And later on, they try to debunk it. National security. National security. They say it was some kind of weather phenomenon. Weather phenomenon. Which is just like what they talked about with the weather balloon from Roswell. Same thing. But yeah, 1952, we had UFOs above the White House. And they stayed there for quite a while. Let's see, what else we got here? Let's see, the person called Air Force Base, located 10 miles from National Airport, reported that they had no unusual objects. The National Airport reported there was no unusual objects on the radar. Let's see here. This is where things get fishy because this was 10 miles away from the White House, I believe. And that's where the cover-up began to take place, probably. Let's see here. Sightings of a strange object who was in the tower, then saw an object which appeared to be like an orange ball of fire trailing a tail. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Let's see, the strange object took off at an unbelievable speed. So it took off as an unbelievable speed because there was another, they tried to debunk it and make it sound like it was a meteor, but it took off at an unbelievable speed. So if it was a meteor, it would fall, but it took off that way. It took off. So it debunks it as a meteor. On one of National Airport's runways, a Captain Airline pilot was waiting in the cockpit to take off after spotting what he believed to be a meteor. He was told that the control tower's radar had detected unknown objects closing in on his position. The person observed the 6 objects, white tails, fast-moving lights over a 14-minute period. In radio contact during his sightings, later related that each sighting concluded with a pipe which could see near his plane. When he reported that the light streaked off at a high speed, it disappeared on our scope. Meanwhile, the control tower personnel were tracking on radar what some thought to be unknown objects, but others suspected, and in one instance were able to prove were simply stars and meteors. Of course, of course. How do stars and meteors fly away? They fall. They don't. It don't make sense. Don't make sense, man. Don't make sense. Let's see. In one instance, prove simply stars. Let's see, observers. Let's see, however, Observed an orange red light to the south. The light would appear to stand still, then make an abrupt change in direction and altitude. This happened several times. At one point, both radar centers at National Airport and the radars at the Air Force Base were tracking an object hovering over a radio beacon. The object vanished in all three radar centers at the same time. At 3 in the morning, shortly before, two United States Air Force jet fighters from Newcastle Air Force Base in Delaware arrived over Washington. All the objects vanished from the radar at National Airport. However, when the jets ran low on fuel and left, the objects returned. The objects returned, which convinced that the UFOs were monitoring radio traffic and behaving accordingly. The objects were last detected by radar at 5:30 a.m. So they were watching and observing. Whatever these crafts were, they were watching on how their military would react to the situation, and it's fascinating. This 1952 thing is fascinating to me. And if we saw something like this now on a wider scale with the internet, it would be huge, man. It'd be huge. It'd be like watching the movie Independence Day, right? Huge, and why were these crafts hanging out at the White House anyways, right? Hanging out at the White House. Well, my theory is, and there's definitely a lot of other people that say the same thing, is that there was negotiations that happened. There was negotiations that happened during that time with these beings, whoever they may be. It could have been the Nazis' high technology, right? It could have been the Nazis' technology. It could be the secret forces. It could be anything, man. I definitely have a lot of theories on that, and I could talk for hours on that. But yeah, I really do feel there's some kind of negotiations during that time period, because it was so interesting in how this all just happens, one thing after another. World War II, the capture of the United States gained 1,600 German scientists. And then this happens, the Roswell thing happened. And then things get even more interesting, because, let's see what we got here. I don't think there's a date on this. Yes, there is a date. All right, so now this is where things get even more interesting. So this is called the space race. The space race refers to the 20th century competition between two Cold War rivals, the Soviet Union and the United States, for dominance in space flight capacity. Now we got the Space Force now, right? Space Force. But they already created this. It's called the space race. Same thing. Space flight capacity. It had its origins in the missile-based nuclear arms race between the two nations that occurred following World War II. Aided by captured German missile technology and personnel from whatever that is program. The technological superiority required for such dominance was seen as necessary for national security. And symbolic of ideological superiority. The space race spawned pioneering efforts to launch artificial satellites, uncrewed space probes of the Moon, Venus, and Mars, and human spaceflight in low Earth orbit and to the Moon. Low Earth orbit, and that's a key thing too. I definitely want to make another video about that. Low Earth orbit. And it's interesting because when they say that, and to the Moon, I don't know, that's something we'll have to talk about in another video, but it's fascinating. The space race began on August 2nd, 1955, 3 years after the Washington incident, when the Soviet Union responded to the U.S. announcement 4 days earlier of intent to launch artificial satellites to the International Geophysical Year by declaring they would also launch a satellite in the near future. The Soviet Union beat the U.S. to this, with October 4th, 1957 orbiting of the Sputnik 1, and later beat the U.S. to the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin, on April 12, 1961. The race peaked with the July 20th, 1969 U.S. landing of the first human on the moon. The USSR tried but failed crewed lunar missions and eventually canceled them and concentrated on Earth orbital space stations. But that makes no sense though. So if the Soviet Union sent the first human in space, it must have been low orbit. So they must have just sent the person out there in Earth's orbit, right? In just some kind of spacecraft. So that makes sense. So the United States wanted to use their national security to make it look like that they landed on the moon, to make it look like the United States was superior. It's oh, what is it? I beat you to it. You know, and they had proof, supposed proof of it, and a lot of it doesn't make any sense. It really doesn't. Let's see, a period of whatever that word is. In April 1972, agreement on cooperative Apollo test project resulting in the July 1975 rendezvous in Earth orbit of a U.S. astronaut crew with Soviet cosmonaut crew. The end of the space race is harder to pinpoint than its beginning, but it was over by December 1991. Dissolution of the Soviet Union, after which true spaceflight cooperation between the U.S. and Russia began. The space race has left a legacy of Earth communications and weather satellites, and continuing human space presence on the International Space Station. It has also sparked increases in spending in education and research and development, which led to beneficial spin-off technologies. So, fascinating stuff. And again, you can read up on this stuff. It talks about World War II, Soviet rocket, and so on and so forth. So yeah, so fascinating. All nice history stuff, man. It really is. Let's see what we got going on here. Oh, hey, we got John joining me. How's it going, John? And we got Firstborn. How's it going? Let's see. John says the day after Roswell is a good book that talks exactly about all this. Oh, cool. I didn't know that. The Nazi Bell, I believe it was. So yeah, quite fascinating. Huh, I might have to look into that book, John. Cool. So yeah, so that's the space race. So, and that's what we got now too. Now we got the Space Force now. Exact same thing. And it's going to be on a wider scale. I really feel that there's something being prepared. There's something being prepared. Maybe another Washington 1952 thing. I don't know. But it's definitely something. Definitely something. And all over the world, people are seeing all these crafts all over the place constantly, you know. And it's hard to say if they're a military origin or if there's something more. I mean, we got Mount Shasta. We got, that ranch. Crap, I can't even think of his name. I have to look up his name. But there's many different interesting things that are going on. There really is. Let's see, what do we got left here? Let's go ahead and read about the moon landing. So a moon landing is arrival of a spacecraft on the surface of the moon. This includes both manned and unmanned missions. The first human manned object to reach the surface of the moon was the Soviet Union's Luna 2 mission on September 13, 1959. So there's a human-made object that was able to reach the surface of the moon from the Soviet Union. That's interesting. The United States was the first manned mission to land on the moon. There have been 6 manned U.S. landings. And then a whole bunch unmanned with no soft landings happening from August 22nd until December 14th. To date, the United States is the only country to have successfully conducted manned missions to the moon, with the last departure of the lunar surface in December 1972. And the thing that fascinates me about this thing is, so we have technology that is beyond words. It's super advanced. But back in the 70s, We didn't have a whole lot of technology, at least not the technology we are aware of. So how did they make it to the moon? How did they make it to the moon? And there was a video by what's his name, ODD or something like that. But I guess NASA's reason for people not going to the moon is because that technology was destroyed. And they can't rebuild the same technology to go back to the moon. Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, how in the 70s did they have that kind of technology go to the moon, and they can't do it now? They can't do it now. And you watch these moon landings, let alone all the moon landing footage has been destroyed, but one, right? I think the very first one's the only one that exists, but all the other ones have been destroyed. That I'm aware of. They've all been destroyed. And according to NASA, it's impossible to go to the moon. It is impossible to go to the moon. They cannot exceed past Earth's low orbit, which I talked about. They cannot exceed past Earth's low orbit. And why is that? It's because of the firmament. So even reading the Bible, there was a firmament that was put over the earth to keep the waters above and the waters below separate from each other. So my theory is you cannot leave Earth. You cannot leave Earth through the sky. You would hit the barrier. You would crash, you would burn. You would die. I mean, it'd be just like hitting a wall, and that'd be it. And that's why I feel that's why scientists say they can only go above Earth's orbit, because they can't go past it. They can't go any farther. It's impossible. And again, that's where national security comes into play. So it's fascinating stuff. You put all this stuff together, it's very fascinating. Let's see what we got here. We're dwindling down to the end of this video. A lot of stuff here. So let's go ahead and talk about NASA, and then we will talk about government space agencies, and then we'll get to the current day events here. So NASA. The agency's leader, NASA administrators, is here. Hold on here. What do we got here? There's a lot to read on here. All right, the national, whatever word is, NASA, is an independent agency of the executive branch of the federal government of the United States, responsible for civilian space program as well as aeronautics and aerospace research. President Eisenhower established NASA in 1958. Again, all this stuff just kind of happens after the World War II, with a distinctive civilian rather than military orientation, encouraging peaceful applications in space science. The National Aeronautics, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, and Space Act was passed on July 29, 1958, disestablishing NASA's predecessor, the National Advisory Committee, which was NACA. So NASA's been around. It was called NACA before. The new agency became operational on October 1st, 1958. Since that time, most U.S. space exploration efforts have been led by NASA, including the supposed moon landing, the Skylab space station, and later the Space Shuttle. Currently, the NASA is supporting the International Space Station and is overseeing the development of the Orion Multipurpose Crew Vehicle, the Space Launch System, and commercial crew vehicles. The agency is also responsible for the Launch Service Program, LSP, which provides oversight of launch operations and countdown management for unmanned NASA launches. NASA science is focused on better understanding Earth through the Earth's observing system, advancing heliophysics through the efforts of Science Mission Directorate's research program, exploring bodies through the solar system with advanced robotic spacecraft missions such as New Horizons, and researching astrophysics topics such as the Big Bang through the Great Observation and assisted programs. NASA shares data with various national and international organizations, such as from the Greenhouse Gases Observing Satellite. From 1946, the National Advisory Committee, NACA, had been experimenting with rocket planes, such as the supersonic Bell X-1. This was in 1946. Again, all this stuff just happens, and this is where the German scientists come into play. Do research on the German scientists and NASA, and you'll learn that all the scientists are the ones that created NASA, and it's big, man, it's big. Let's see, experimented with rocket planes such as the supersonic Bell X-1 in the early 1950s. There were challenged to launch an artificial satellite in 1957 to 58. An effort for this was the American Project Vanguard. After the Soviet launch of the world's first artificial satellite, the attention of the United States turned towards its own fledgling space efforts, alarmed by the preserved threat of national security. See, preserved threat of national security and technological leadership, known as the Sputnik crisis, urged immediate and swift action. President Eisenhower and his advisors counseled more deliberate measures on 1958. NACA organized a special committee on space technology headed by a person. Like I said, you can look up all these names if you want. I try to avoid names to not get kicked off. You don't talk about names, you usually don't get kicked off, so it's all good. It is of great urgency and importance to our country, both from consideration of our prestige as a nation as well as military necessity, that this challenge, Sputnik, be met by an energetic program of research and development for the conquest of space. It is accordingly proposed that the scientific research be the responsibility of a national civilian agency. NACA is capable, by rapid extension and expansion of its efforts, of providing leadership in space technology. And the fascinating thing about this speech here is the exact same speech that I don't know his name, Donald Trump, or Trump's advisor, I don't know his name, Pierce, I think it is, I don't know, but he said this exact same thing for the Space Force. Exact same thing. It's a rerun. It's a rerun. You know, this was the space race thing we talked about, and now they're doing the Space Force. Exact same thing, but they're doing it. They're making it sound like I guess they're just gonna really just kind of let their advanced spacecraft technology be more out there. I've gone, oh hey, look, we got a Enterprise from Star Trek flying around in space. You know, maybe that's what they're planning to do. They're going to have these Deep Space Nine or Star Trek style ships out there that are military structures. So basically, I mean, if they really wanted to, and they already do this with satellites, if they really wanted to, they could create space tanks up in space. And maybe that's what they're planning to do. Space tanks, you know, you never know. My theory, there's a lot of theories out there. You know, my theory is that we already have, and there's so many testimonies out there, is we already have spacecraft out there that are cloaked, right? There's cloaking technology. No surprise there. There's also technology, not just cloaking, but you can actually transform your spacecraft to where it's all mirrors, it's all reflections. So you would theoretically be cloaked. I mean, you wouldn't really be cloaked, but you would be irradiating, or what is it, reflecting everything else. So, you know, if the sky's blue, it's going to radiate that. You know, if it's dark outside, it's going to show stars and stuff like that. You wouldn't realize it was there. So I mean, you know, our military already have that already. So, you know, they're already hidden already. But I say that there's also other beings that are up there as well. Dan Aykroyd, watch the documentary that Dan Aykroyd did with his what he experienced with his UFO things. I mean, there was this huge huge ship that flew over wherever he lived at. I don't remember where he lived at. I haven't watched that thing in a long time. But huge thing. It was like a football stadium size, he said. And there's been many other accounts, testimonies of the same thing, of this big football-sized ship flying around. And we could have that right now. I mean, you could go outside right now and have a big ship out there, and you wouldn't even realize it was there. You wouldn't even realize it was there because it was cloaked. Same with clouds. Clouds, I feel, play a big impact as well. I mean, you can go into science and all that stuff. But to me, if there is a huge cloud out there and it hasn't moved for a long time, but all these other clouds are moving, there's something there. They're using it as some kind of cloaking device. And, I mean, it's just theories, but, I'm a person that does deep research and really doesn't rule out the possibilities. I mean, you can't rule out the possibilities of all this stuff because there's just too much proof. There's too much proof and there's too much testimonies of what's going on out there. So yeah. So I think it's pretty much it for NASA. Like I said, NASA is pretty much a German-run national security program, just to kind of keep things under wraps. I mean, if NASA says that they're in control of, space, they're going to feed you whatever you want. I've never been to space before. They can only they can only stay in Earth's lower orbit. So they can't move past that. They don't know what's beyond Earth's orbit. They don't. And there's not much else to it. And only select few people can actually even go into space, if they're even in space. They talked about unmanned rockets and spacecraft and things like that. I mean, that's all they really need is just unmanned cameras. Unmanned cameras. They can send drones up there. With the technology we have, they can set up a computer-based program where they can just do whatever they need to down here on Earth, but they can control everything on that space station. So you don't need humans up there anyways. It's kind of where the world we're going into now is a place where I'm talking so much my mouth is getting dry. We're starting to live in a world where everything is being run by artificial intelligence, by AI. So, I mean, it makes sense that there would be nobody in space. Because it would get rid of a lot of the secrets for that national security of what's going on up there. You got a spacecraft up there in Earth's lower orbit. You see all these unidentified UFOs up there. You can't tell humanity right now, that there's aircraft all over the place. They would freak out. They wouldn't know what to do. And, and that's why they have this national security thing, because they don't want to pose a worldwide phenomenon. I mean, if the president decided to go on right now and say, all right, we've been in contact with these beings since the 1940s. Okay, we'll just put a date on there. Since the 1940s. They made a peace treaty with them in 1952, with the United, in the Washington incident. They made a treaty with them, okay? And then they explained what the treaty was, experimentations, genetic manipulation, altering, giving up their human population, right? Their human population. For experiments and so on and so forth. You learn that the human race was made genetically by some ET beings, right? It would make everybody freak out. They'd be like, no, man, there's no way. Or people would be freaking out, going, oh my gosh, what is going on here? We've been lied to the whole time. It's a touchy subject. I don't really feel that humanity would be ready for that kind of awareness. That's why I make these kind of videos. It's just to make you think that this stuff is out there. You do your research, put the pieces of the puzzle together. You realize that there's something going on. But you also come to a more mature understanding of why they don't tell you, why they keep you distracted, and things like that. There's so much more to it. Again, with World War II, there was something about the Europeans and the United States that the other countries are extremely worried about. And throughout, granted, they created the United Nations um, with China and stuff, but granted, they still have the same thing that the United States tries to dominate the world for some reason. And again, it dates back to um, the secret societies, um, the Illuminati, the Skull and Bones, but it gets much deeper than that. Much deeper, much darker than that. That's just when they talk about the Illuminati and the Freemason stuff, that's just the starting point. There's something much deeper, something much darker. And that's why I've been talking about witchcrafts, and I'm going to talk more about sorcerers and warlocks as well. Very deep stuff because it gets dark. It gets really really dark. Um, and as you guys have been seeing, for those watching on Facebook, let me go ahead and take these images off here because I've been talking for an hour. Yeah. So, but as you've been seeing with these images here, um, it does get real dark. It does get real dark. And there's a lot of, when you watch TV shows and movies, that's our disclosure. That's our disclosure. Um, I've learned so much more from movies and TV shows than I ever have from anything else. Even through my research, I watch something and I'm like, man, that clicked. That movie clicked. Go do some research. Same stuff. You just put the piece of puzzle together. Stranger Things. Stranger Things. Phenomenal movie based in the 70s or 80s, somewhere around there. 70s or 80s. Based on real stuff. There's some real stuff. You do some research. It's based off real things. It's based off of what I talked about previously and how. I'm trying to find my water here. It's based on how they are trying to find the psychic link, right? And they're doing that now. Like I showed you in Fox News, they're trying to recruit or look um, into psychics, into remote viewing again. And I talked about that in my previous videos too, about remote viewing and psychics, telepathy. Looking at those three things, the concerns of national security. Concerns of national security. So in Stranger Things, they had that character named Eleven, and they just kind of show you just what could happen if you had those kind of abilities. The X-Men. Fascinated with the X-Men. Always been fascinated with mutants because I really feel that there's something much more to it. There's something much more to it. Somebody's telling us something. Excuse me. And someone was telling me too is that a lot of the X-Men stories, because I collect trade paperbacks of X-Men and stuff, so a lot of the stories have to do with the Bible and different kinds of scenarios that take place that actually involve a lot of our history as well. So it's uncanny. It really is. There's so many things that are linked up. But with Stranger Things though, and this is a video I want to make later, is that it involves this other world or this other dimension that they've discovered. And the thing is that they don't try to close it. They want to know what it is, and they want to utilize those creatures as military military advantage, right? They want to have these genetic hybrids, and they still do that to this day. I mean, that's part of what the German scientists did, was experiment as well, and it goes real deep. It goes deep. I mean, throughout Egyptian history, they mess with genetics. I was reading Genesis again because I was watching a video and it was talking on how the earth was made and how mankind was made, and when you read through, I think it was Genesis 3 I was reading, Genesis chapter 3, and it was reading on how there was Adam and Eve and how they were in a Garden of Eden and how the Elohim uh, made humanity, but there was also the serpents that also walked among them as well, that also walked among them, some kind of creature. I guess I had to do research. I think it was a seraphim, translates to uh, to the serpent or a reptilian type structure. I had to look into it. I was just kind of watching this video here, but it was fascinating because to me, reading the book of Genesis really sounds like the Garden of Eden was actually in some kind of dome structure itself, some kind of genetic research facility. And it makes sense too because of how it talks about and how mankind was formed from the dust of the ground. Well, theoretically, we couldn't really be made from dirt. I mean, dirt is minerals, stuff like that. We couldn't really be made by dirt. So it'd be something more. So like you can look at the the representation of dirt or the dust of the ground as genetics, right? As genetics. Same way with how the woman was made from the rib of Adam, which would be genetics, hinting at genetics, So they had this whole experimentation area. It was a science area, and they made all the animals, right, through genetics. They made all the animals, and they made humans, and they made females through genetic encoding. And I showed that on my pictures as well, through genetic encoding. And I mean, you can go into and how they clone other animals. They put them in tubes. They already put out there already that they can make tube babies. They can make tube babies, and this is the future. This is the plan for the future, is to make tube babies where they'll get your genetics, right? They'll get your genetics. They'll put it into this tube, and you can alter the genetics of your baby. So if you want it to be smarter, you can put it in there. If you want them to be a certain height, you can manipulate the genetic structure of your baby. So when it's born, it's going to be a hybrid human based on what you wanted it to be. So then, therefore, there would be no natural births anymore. Horrible, horrible. I mean, it's fascinating too, but it's you're playing with God, and the stuff is happening 24/7 all the time. This genetic stuff has constantly been going. Is this stuff ending? I'm sure it is, and it's really hard to talk about this stuff because the world is changing, the world is evolving. We're seeing things unfolding. We're seeing the truth being revealed. And we're seeing the old world collapse. We're seeing the old world collapse from a physical level. But the underground stuff, the hidden stuff, is also going away too. So I mean, a lot of this stuff will be brought to light anyways. But you need to be ready for it. You need to be prepared for it. So when the truth does come out, because it will eventually, it won't be such a shock value, I guess. I mean, people could have a heart attack if they find out if all this stuff is true, right? So it's fascinating stuff. So yeah, so this was definitely fun for me. Thank you guys for joining me in the chat rooms. Definitely appreciate it. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, though, this is why it's so important. I'm all about spirituality. I'm all about discovering the best version of you. Through all the chaos that we learn about life, and that we're continuing to learn. I mean, is there ET beings that rule this planet or run this planet? There probably is. Are we manipulated and controlled through politics and money and churches and military dominance? Yeah, we are. I mean, that's a proven fact. Yeah, we are. So at the end of the day, you need to have something to go back to. The world, the outside world will corrupt you and make you go crazy. It will make you go crazy. You need to go back to something that's more important, and that is within inside yourself. Discovering the Christ within you. You don't have to be religious to find a peace within yourself, a peace within yourself. Christ is my foundation. There's a creator, that created all of us. I mean, from a human standpoint, maybe we were all born in tubes. I don't know. I don't know. I know I came out of my mama, so I came out naturally, so that's a good thing. But at the end of the day, man, it's we really have to find that inner peace within self. Inner peace within self, learning how to mature the mind, mature the body, mature the soul. That's one of the key things as we're going through life, and how we can help people out. There's so many people that suffer through depression, anxiety, drug abuse, abuse within the household, whether it be child abuse, whatever it may be. People suffer out there, and we have to extend our hand out to them and let them know that there is a love that cares for them, and then they can change their life for the better. And at the end of the day, that's what I'm all about. I love doing this research stuff as something that we need to be aware of, but at the end of the day, it's about taking yourself and becoming the best version of you, the most mature version of you. So when you go back out into the world, you can help people out. So if this stuff does come out to the open, hey, the world is run by ETs, everybody's freaking out. They'll be like, all right, what do we do now? Oh yeah, I remember hearing this guy named Starseed Bey talking about this stuff and how we need to be prepared for what's to come next. What's to come next is to go with inside self and just be in a more mature manner if this stuff takes place. So yeah, I can get real deep on this stuff. I really can. So yeah, so thank you guys for tuning in. I love you all very much. Love yourself. Keep shining bright. Just realize that there's so much more to life. So much more to life than the human mind can even fathom or imagine. That's what we just have to learn to work with each other. Share our truths, share our testimonies, and just put all these pieces of the puzzle together. That's the power of research, the power of knowledge and wisdom, is learning more and more and more about what was taken away from us, and how we need to gain back that unity that's been taken away from us. We need to unite again. Yeah, uniting is key. Working together is key. Creating tribes is key. So yeah, so love yourself, keep shining bright, and I'll talk to you guys later.